There is a silence that lives inside certain relationships, not the comfortable kind, not the silence of two people who have said everything and rest easily in what remains. This is a different silence, tighter, more pressurized. The silence of someone who is feeling something enormous and has absolutely no pathway to the outside of it. You have probably sat across from this silence, or lain beside it, or felt it arrive in the middle of a moment that was supposed to be close, and watched something shut behind their eyes like a shutter closing against too much light. And you probably did what most people do. You wondered what you did. You softened yourself further. You reached or you stopped reaching, neither of which changed the temperature by very much. What you were sitting across from was not emptiness. It was the opposite of emptiness. It was a person so full of something they could not metabolize that the only available response was stillness, containment. The appearance of absence as a management strategy for overwhelming presence. What lives inside that silence, what the avoidant craves with an intensity that would surprise you during the moments of intimacy that frighten them most, is what this is about. The first thing they crave, and perhaps the most foundational, is stillness that does not require explanation. Not distance, stillness. There is a difference that matters enormously and almost never gets named. Distance is the absence of connection. Stillness is the presence of connection without demand. It is the experience of being near someone without the nearness generating pressure to perform, to open, to meet the moment with more emotional availability than is currently accessible. When intimacy arrives, real intimacy, the kind with actual weight and proximity and the full presence of another person directed at them, the avoidant nervous system does not simply feel warmth. It feels the warmth and simultaneously feels the weight of what the warmth is asking. The implicit request inside closeness. The expectation, even when it is entirely gentle, that something will be given in return. That the intimacy will be received, reciprocated, matched. And the inability to immediately match it, which is not indifference but a genuine neurological delay, a system that processes emotional experience on a different timeline than most, produces something that feels, internally, like failing in real time. What they crave is a person who can be close without the closeness becoming a question, who can offer warmth without the warmth being a request for confirmation that the warmth was received and welcome, who can simply be there, fully, genuinely there, and not need the there-ness to be immediately acknowledged. This is rarer than it sounds. Most people, when they offer closeness and feel it not being returned in kind, experience hurt. And hurt produces its own communication, even when it is unspoken. A subtle withdrawal, a shift in quality of presence, a waiting that becomes its own form of pressure. The avoidant feels all of it, every calibration, every micro-adjustment, and each one adds to the weight of what the moment is asking. What they also crave, running just beneath that, is to be wanted without being consumed. The distinction between being wanted and being consumed is one that most people in the position of loving an avoidant understand viscerally, even if they have not had language for it. Being wanted feels like someone moving toward you because you are compelling to them, because your specific existence generates genuine attraction. Being consumed feels like someone moving toward you because they need something from you that your presence might provide. The avoidant body knows the difference, not always consciously, but the nervous system reads it, accurately and immediately. When the desire coming toward them feels like consumption, when the intimacy carries the energy of someone who needs the connection in order to be okay, the system activates. Not because the need is wrong, because the need lands as pressure. And pressure in a system built around managing encroachment produces one predictable response. But when the desire coming toward them is clean, when it says, I want you specifically, and I am also fine, and this wanting is coming from fullness rather than lack, something different happens in the nervous system. The approach does not trigger the alarm in the same way. The desire can be received rather than managed. And in being received, something in the avoidant is briefly, genuinely open. They crave that kind of wanting, the kind that costs them nothing to receive, the kind that does not arrive with an invoice attached. Here is something that almost never gets talked about. Avoidants crave being seen accurately, not idealized, not projected onto, not turned into the person the partner needs them to be in order for the relationship to make sense. Accurately, with full awareness of their limitations, their contradictions, their specific and sometimes frustrating interior, and wanted anyway. Idealization is, paradoxically, a form of invisibility. When someone sees you through the lens of who they hope you are, rather than who you actually are, there is an eerie quality of loneliness to it, of being present with someone who is, in a meaningful way, not actually present with you, who is present with their idea of you. And the gap between the idea and the reality is always felt by the person being idealized, sometimes as flattery, but underneath that, as isolation. The avoidant who is being idealized knows, at some level, that the image being loved is not quite them. And that knowledge introduces a specific anxiety, because eventually the idea will be tested against the reality, and the reality will disappoint. The eventual disappointment is anticipated from the beginning, and that anticipation is one of the forces that drives the preemptive withdrawal. Better to create the distance now than to wait for the collapse of the ideal to create it later. What pierces through all of that, what the avoidant actually hungers for in intimacy, is someone who sees the reality, the defended, complicated, sometimes maddening reality, and does not flinch, does not fix, does not begin the project of making the avoidant into something more emotionally available, just sees accurately and stays. That accurate seeing and staying is the most intimate experience available to them, and it is the one they are least likely to ask for, because asking for it would require acknowledging the hunger. Touch. The craving around touch is complicated in a way that deserves its own space. There is a myth embedded in the cultural understanding of avoidant attachment that suggests avoidants simply do not want physical closeness, that the preference for distance extends into the physical domain as cleanly and completely as it appears to exist in the emotional one. This is not accurate. What is true is that touch, for many avoidants, carries an emotional weight that it does not carry for everyone else. Because the nervous system that learned to manage emotional input, to suppress, to redirect, to contain, did not learn to do that for physical experience in the same way. The body is harder to manage than the mind. Physical closeness, when it arrives with genuine warmth and without agenda, can bypass the defenses in a way that verbal intimacy cannot always reach. This is simultaneously what makes it craved and what makes it complicated. Touch that arrives without demand, without the expectation of emotional reciprocity, without the quality of being held in place by it, can feel like the clearest experience of safety they access in a relationship. The body registers the care before the mind can construct a defense against it. And in that brief window, something genuinely settles. But touch that arrives as a request, that is clearly organized around getting something in return, reassurance, confirmation, emotional response, lands very differently. It becomes another form of intimacy with an invoice, and the system responds accordingly. What they crave is the former, touch that is simply given, that makes no argument and requires no answer, that exists as its own complete thing, rather than as the opening move of an emotional negotiation. They crave permission to be slow. This is perhaps the most practically important thing on this list, and it is the one most consistently denied, not out of cruelty, but out of the entirely understandable human impulse to want emotional experiences to be mutual and simultaneous. The avoidant emotional system does not operate in real time. This is not a character flaw. It is a structural feature of how the nervous system learned to process emotional experience. The feeling arrives, the containment response activates before the feeling can fully register. And by the time the conscious mind catches up, by the time there is access to what the feeling actually was and what it meant, the moment has often passed. In the middle of an intimate moment, this delay feels, from the inside, like being slightly underwater, able to see what is happening, able to register that something significant is occurring, but separated from it by a layer that makes real-time response feel slightly impossible. The words that would meet the moment exist somewhere. They are just not yet accessible. What happens next, in most relationships, is that the delay is experienced by the partner as rejection or emotional absence. And the experience of being perceived as rejecting, in a moment when the avoidant was actually simply slow, produces shame. And shame accelerates the shutdown, and the shutdown produces more distance. And the cycle has begun again from a starting point of a simple timing difference. The craving, rarely articulated, sometimes not even consciously known, is for someone who will wait, not out of tolerance, not out of patience performing itself, out of genuine understanding that the interior is moving, just not at the pace the exterior might suggest. The intimacy that allows for slowness, without interpreting the slowness as absence, is an intimacy the avoidance system can eventually relax into, and relaxing into it is the beginning of everything. Safety. The word gets used so frequently, it has begun to lose its texture. But the specific quality of safety the avoidant craves in intimacy is worth examining with precision. It is not safety from conflict. Avoidants are not uniformly conflict averse. Some are quite capable of direct disagreement and intellectual challenge. What they are averse to is emotional unpredictability. The experience of not knowing, in a given moment of intimacy, what the emotional weather will become, whether the warmth they are currently receiving will shift into demand, whether the closeness will remain at its current level of intensity or escalate, whether showing any degree of openness will be met with a reciprocal degree of care or with an intensification that will require more from them than they can currently give. The safety they crave is the safety of predictability, of knowing that the intimacy will not suddenly exceed what they have capacity for and leave them stranded in a moment of overwhelm with no available exit. Of knowing that their slowness will not become the subject of the conversation, that their partial opening will not be leveraged for a demand for fuller opening. This is what makes emotional consistency, not emotional intensity, consistency, so deeply settling for an avoidant. The partner who is the same person in vulnerability as they are in ease, who does not escalate the emotional register of an intimate moment by responding to any degree of avoidant opening with heightened urgency or increased pressure, who lets the small opening be a small opening without rushing to make it larger. Small openings with a consistently safe person eventually become larger openings, not on any prescribed timeline, not on demand, but organically, gradually, because the evidence accumulates that larger openings do not produce the outcomes the system was designed to prevent. Here is one that lives very deep. They crave being the one who reaches sometimes, without it being a production, without it being noted and responded to with an enthusiasm that makes the reaching feel like a significant event, because significant events require significance in return, and that requirement closes the door again. In most avoidant dynamics, the pattern of who reaches and who receives becomes fixed very quickly. The anxiously attached partner pursues. The avoidant receives and manages the pursuit. And this pattern, once established, makes reaching feel, for the avoidant, like a violation of the established order, like stepping outside a role that the dynamic has made structural. The approaching always comes from one direction. And because it always comes from one direction, the avoidant's own approach, the moments when something in them genuinely wants to move closer, to reach, to offer something of the interior, becomes loaded, significant, something that will be responded to with weight. And weight, again, is the thing that closes things down. The craving beneath this is for a dynamic where reaching happens in both directions so naturally that no single instance of reaching carries too much meaning, where the avoidant can move toward without the movement being treated as an event, where small gestures of closeness are received and returned without ceremony, where the intimacy breathes, in and out, rather than existing as a one-directional current that requires management. They crave being found interesting, not charming, not lovable in a soft and forgiving way, not acceptable despite their complexity. Genuinely, intellectually, specifically interesting. This might seem like a surprising entry in a list about intimacy, but for the avoidant, whose relationship with emotional connection is fraught, and whose relationship with intellectual and energetic engagement is often far more comfortable, being found deeply interesting is a form of intimacy. It is a form of being seen that does not require the emotional exposure that other forms of closeness demand. And it is, often, the door through which deeper intimacy can eventually walk. When a partner engages with the avoidant's actual mind, their ideas, their particular way of seeing things, their specific brand of insight or humour or curiosity, without immediately trying to redirect the conversation toward the emotional content of the relationship, something opens. The conversation becomes a place that is safe to inhabit. And a place that is safe to inhabit is a place where the defences can afford to lower slightly, because no attack is coming, no demand is arriving, no emotional negotiation is required. From that slightly lowered defense, warmer things become possible. The intellectual engagement is not a substitute for emotional intimacy. It is, for this particular nervous system, often the corridor that leads there. There is a craving that lives underneath all of the others, harder to name, more tender. They crave being wanted back to themselves, not changed, not improved, not guided toward a more emotionally available version of who they are. Wanted back to themselves, to the interior that was shut down or dampened or redirected by the early experiences that created the pattern in the first place. To the version of themselves that existed before the architecture was constructed, the self that reached without fear, that needed without shame, that felt without immediately beginning the process of managing the feeling. There is something in the avoidant, something beneath the competence and the self-sufficiency and the carefully maintained distance, that wants to be coaxed back, not forced, not pressured, not loved loudly into openness, coaxed by the quality of a presence so consistently safe, so genuinely without agenda, so evidently capable of holding what might emerge without catastrophizing it or weaponizing it or being overwhelmed by it, that the system begins to question its own necessity. The craving is for the relationship that makes the defense feel, gradually and undramatically, like something that is no longer as necessary as it once was. That does not remove the defense by force, but makes the defense slowly irrelevant through the accumulated evidence of safety. This cannot be rushed, cannot be demanded, cannot be loved into existence by any volume of effort. It requires the rarest combination of qualities in a partner: genuine self-possession, accurate perception, emotional steadiness, and the long patience of someone who understands that what they are waiting for is not the avoidant choosing to open, but the avoidant's nervous system slowly, cellularly, revising a belief that was written into it before it had words. And what they will never say out loud, what lives at the very bottom of all of this, is that they are tired. Tired of the management, tired of the distance that does not actually feel like freedom, but like a very sophisticated cage. Tired of the loneliness that comes not from being alone, but from being with someone and still being, in the most interior sense, entirely alone. Tired of the feelings that arrive and immediately go underground. Tired of catching glimpses in other people's relationships or in their own rarest moments of openness of what it might feel like to simply rest in another person, without the alarm sounding, without the system mobilizing, without the whole elaborate machinery of self-protection spinning up between the feeling and the expression of the feeling. They want to rest in you, without it meaning the end of themselves. They do not know how to say this. They may not even know, consciously, that it is true. But it is the thing that all the other cravings are pointing toward. It is the thing that the silence, in its most honest moments, is trying to say. And the person who can create the conditions for that rest, not by demanding it, not by explaining to the avoidant that they are safe, but by simply being, consistently and authentically, a person in whose presence the alarm has no good reason to sound. That person is not forgotten, not by the nervous system that finally, briefly, exhaled. Not ever.